best practices for data labeling in the age of CMMC. This is something, of course, that many organizations within the DIB are asking about or thinking through. And we're excited today to talk about some of our findings and recommendations as we have gone through this with a number of customers, many customers over the years. My name is Matt Nevins. I'm a senior cloud strategist for aerospace and defense here at Planet. 14 years here at Planet, about 5 years in this role, specifically delivering to the defense industrial base. Give a quick agenda here. We'll talk about some basics of data labeling. We'll pepper in some basic information as we go through the deck today. We'll talk about why data labeling matters for CMMC and a little bit why it matters for Copilot. Can't have a presentation without talking about Copilot these days. We'll talk about some label hygiene and taxonomy design and some best practices there. There's certainly a discussion around automation with the available features within Microsoft Purview. There's always a user training and adoption aspect to these things. We'll talk about some of the things we found, how we've mitigated or helped organizations make sure and prepare their users for either potentially a revamped labeling approach. You may be using labels today in a different way, or for organizations that this is net new, using something like Purview information protection. We'll talk about how that can be adopted. We'll cover some governance and lifecycle management of labels. This is important because as with anything, your labeling taxonomy and how they apply and the specificity is going to evolve over time. And so how do we make sure that you guys are adopting with that? Have some real world lessons, Q&A, then we've got a couple of sent in questions as well that we'll go through. As always, if you have a question as we're going through the deck, feel free to raise your hand and come off mute or put it in the chat and we'll make sure we get that addressed. So talking about some basics of data labeling, there's really kind of 4 key pillars to the basics of data labeling as it relates to Microsoft 365 and the data that can reside there. The first is knowing your data. While this is somewhat easy when we think about the defined types of data that we can really easily find, like PHI or PCI or HIPAA data, we live in the world of CUI and ITAR and EAR, which are generally much more difficult to define. So how do we figure out how to know your data, right? Understanding it across the entire landscape, where it lives, what it looks like, who is accessing it, who should not be accessing it, and how it should be able to be shared. That goes into the second pillar of protecting your data. So as we have identified that data, we then need to have the appropriate protections in place, like labeling, as well as some other aspects of M365 Purview that apply protections that include things like encryption, access restrictions, visual markings, etc. Next, since we've now figured out what our data is, we've applied protections, we can then layer in things like data loss prevention. This is where we're figuring out, okay, there's a person in the organization who maybe intentionally or unintentionally is trying to share data outside of the organization that's not supposed to be. In doing so, we need to make sure that we're utilizing things like data loss prevention or insider risk to mitigate those. And then lastly is the fourth pillar, which we won't talk about too much today. It's really its own conversation, which is data governance. So the idea of how long data needs to reside, where it should live, who should have access to it, how long it should be discoverable, all those types of things around records retention, etc. Those are all a bunch of other parts of Purview that are available, but today we're going to focus really on those first 3 core aspects. So taking that a step further about kind of aligning with parts of the Purview estate that you might already own, since this is called You Already Own It, aligning some feature functionality there just to kind of level set. So when we talk about know your data, we use things like custom sensitive information types or pre-built ones, but generally for CUI, we're going to be using custom sensitive information types. You might hear those referred to as SITs. There's the concept of trainable classifiers, which is really a very easy way to create a model of what data looks like in your environment. So you actually utilize AI to create a trainable classifier by creating SharePoint sites and repositories that have both positive examples and then non-examples of the data you're trying to identify. And then over the course of several training sessions, the trainable classifier will become aware, and it will eventually continue to learn as well. So trainable classifiers are a great way for us to identify CUI in places we might not know it exists, and then it's potentially use that trainable classifier to then classify data. And then data classification all up, where we use signature types or those types of things around creating those data classifications themselves. Protecting your data, the starting point there is sensitivity labels or purview labels, purview information protection. And those labels come in very different, many forms. So they could be everything from, again, creating watermarks or applying header and footer or applying encryption. And then also they can also apply to different sources. And we'll talk about that a little bit more deeply as we get in. There's message encryption through Exchange Online, and then a more advanced route would be to use something like Defender for Cloud Apps on more policy-based. And then talking about data loss, so we have Purview DLP, which is all up. We have Endpoint DLP, which is going to look for exfil through things like USB drives or copying to third-party sharing sites. And there's also Teams DLP, which allows you to specifically identify content or meetings and have those protected as well and prevent data loss there. And lastly, as I mentioned, there's a fourth pillar there around governing data, which won't be a topic today, but maybe in the future. So, quick poll here. Just kind of wondering how familiar you are with your organization's current strategy on data labeling. So, I believe Casey's going to put that up. And I'll be interested to see these results because if we think about, where the DIB has been for many years, with really 800.171 being the framework that most organizations needed to comply with, there should have really been a data label strategy, at least documented in an SSP. So we'll be interested to see where folks are at on that front. So as those results are coming in, yes, looks like quite a few folks aren't necessarily formal about the strategy yet. Well, hopefully this session today helps with that. So let's talk about aligning to CMMC, the data labeling, and the role of that within CMMC. So, and we'll get into some specific controls in a little bit about what those map to. But there is quite a few controls that labeling can help address. So, of course, CMMC requires identification and protection of CUI through several different control families. Sensitivity labels are generally the best way to approach that. These can apply both on-premises and in Microsoft 365, as well as in third-parties, clouds, and Azure. And then, of course, again, labels are also going to dictate some of what Copilot can access once it actually becomes available in GCC High. As an aside, we're doing a number of large Copilot deployments over on the commercial side, and labeling and information protection, as we expect, is a very important part of that to make sure that Copilot isn't able to access content outside of a user's own home realm. And again, we'll jump into more details on the CMMC side here in a second. Just to take a little quick detour, as I mentioned, Copilot does take its ability to scan and infer based on several different aspects, but labels can be one of those, right? So making sure that me as a user doesn't have access to Project X because that is not a project that or a program that I'm working on, is certainly going to take into account there. And then really all up, labeling is foundational to any AI adoption within M365, Azure, as well, as labels, again, are going to function not only across Copilot, but across OpenAI or any other type of AI solution that you want to deploy. So thinking about some security concerns associated with AI usage, again, you can see some examples here of data leakage, of data oversharing, where users may have access or should not have access to specific data. And we want to make sure that any AI apps or AI engines don't have access to that. And then there's also the critical thing of having users trying to use data in a non-compliant way. So what was the first thing I think a lot of us learned in the first couple of months back a couple of years ago when we started using things like ChatGPT to maybe help us with documents or presentations or whatever, was don't put your corporate information into ChatGPT. And that applies right to any information you're trying to infer or have responses to. And so that's, of course, really important. There's some great tools coming down the pike that Microsoft has that will help with that. But until Copilot launches in GCC High, a lot of those will be over in the commercial side, but not quite available. And again, how do we address these? Is there a question? Okay. So how, just again, wrapping up on the AI side, right? So you'll see a theme here: discover and protect sensitive content throughout its life cycle. Understand user activity. So this takes the idea of labels and content a step further, right? This is where things like insider risk are going to come into play, where we're actually looking at user behavior. Is a user continually trying to access a program SharePoint site when they really shouldn't have access to it? Or have they successfully accessed it, exfilled data, and are trying to email it somewhere? Those types of things. And then, of course, securing devices, apps, services, etc. So getting back to labeling all up and as it relates to CMMC, just some high-level pitfalls that we have seen so far in our many deployments that we've done on this front. The starting point for a lot of the organizations that we're assisting is that they have labels today, and they've had a labeling taxonomy for many years, and label sprawl has become almost untenable from a user perspective. There's not just 10 labels, there's dozens, maybe up to 100 and some, in some cases, that were created for specific programs and likely created with technology that wasn't necessarily as flexible as purview information protection is these days. And so, part of it is probably a fault of the mature ability to have a concise labeling taxonomy from the technology side, but then also that there wasn't a well-governed set of labels that were chosen for specific reasons to meet business goals that didn't necessarily, for example, align with programs. There's inconsistent naming and unclear hierarchies. We'll talk about some of those best practices here in a second. But as you may or may not know, the DoD does put out their CUI marking guide. And so there are specific examples of how CUI should be marked, whether that's a label and then a sublabel for controlled, 2 forward slashes, and then ITAR or EAR, something like that. Again, we'll see those here in a second. Another, obviously a big one is if organization has previously had a labeling taxonomy or labeling program in place, likely it's probably not aligned with a compliance framework, probably more likely aligned to their business, their business agreements with their customers, with their primes or their subs. And then I think one big thing, which I think is a big take we'll talk about here in a second, is with the more modern version of Purview, we have this ability to collect lots and lots of data without actually intruding upon users. So instead of taking labels and putting them out and just forcing them on users, we can actually gather data ahead of time. We can see what's happening in the environment, how labels might have been applied before we actually either make that mandatory or make a default label. So thinking about label hygiene and structure, kind of going back to the first point on the previous slide, fewer well-defined labels are going to make it easier for users to understand and also drive consistency with how content is actually labeled. We have seen in initial adoptions for organizations of medium size that generally 3 to 5 parent labels with a subset of sublabels generally is the best approach to take. This will allow a couple of kind of stakeholders, probably goals to be met. One is that the compliance team feels comfortable that the label taxonomy is going to be able to be documented and defended well within the organization and within an assessment. It meets the most likely the contractual obligations to be able to label data appropriately in a way that is approved. And then lastly, it meets from a security perspective and an end user perspective an ease of being able to adopt those labels and begin to use them. And again, aligning labels with critical data types like CUI, ITAR, EAR, et cetera. Again, we'll see some examples here actually on the next slide. So thinking about label naming conventions, using clear descriptive names, in this case, CUI / export controlled, is a well-known, well-defined label within the DoD labeling taxonomy guidance. We want to avoid acronyms or jargon that aren't familiar to users. And while CUI is probably not familiar to somebody that doesn't work in the DIB, certainly most, if not all, users in the DIB are going to be familiar with what CUI means, along with people who actually use data that might be ITAR export controlled or EAR, et cetera. That they will know those particular acronyms. And then lastly, utilize descriptions and utilize the functionality of Purview itself. So I have an example here of what a basic labeling structure might look like. It says planets, and wasn't able to capture it because the way the tooltip screenshots, but if you were to hover over theirs, each one of these will actually give you a tooltip of what you might consider to be confidential or highly confidential, or what the sublabels mean in that sense as well. I've got a couple more screenshots. We'll see some more examples of that. So I want to touch a little bit more on policy simulation. So I mentioned that with the modern version of Purview, we've unlocked a lot of capabilities that allow us to gather as much data as possible, do a small pilot, understand user feedback, and then understand where the impact is going to be potentially on users. So we can do this in several different ways. First is understanding the scope of how you want to apply, right? So we can use a subset of SharePoint sites, Teams, OneDrive, or email users. These could be groups. We can scope that however we'd like to, right? So generally, when we're thinking about standing up a labeling program, because it really needs to be thought of as a program, right? This is not a overnight thing that happens. So when we think about standing up a program, most likely you're going to have champions. You're going to have organizational change folks that are going to lead that conversation with users. Obviously, the technical side of things, business owners, and the compliance team. And so the first thing you most likely are going to do is start to identify pilots or alpha type users or business units, et cetera, sectors that might be best to actually be the pilot users of this. Now, what's great about this is that when we identify them, we can start by not even actually doing anything to them or providing them with anything to do. We can simply start to, and again, we'll see some screenshots a little bit later. We can start to actually look at the data that those users have access to and start to inventory and use our custom information type, sensitive information types through AI to tell us here's where there are 9,000 CUI documents identified in this SharePoint site. Great, now let's go actually understand how accurate that is. Let's go find the owners of that information and start to understand how we go about protecting it. So the second part kind of jumped into there is simulate into the production environment. So the simulation, like I said, is about gathering data, and we're not necessarily putting an onus on end users or an end user change in their court, right? We can get some great insights into how those things would have been applied. And then we can actually review those results, iterate, improve accuracy, and by the end of it, we have the ability to turn on those policies. And we have, again, we'll talk about here in a second, labeling at scale. We have different ways to set this forth into users' daily lives, whether that be through various different means. So policy simulation is really, I think, a really key aspect to a larger program and labeling at scale and not introducing too much change at once, as well as not affecting the businesses directly negatively or end users' day-to-day work. So let's talk about labeling at scale and some guiding principles here. So we really have three different ways of labeling at scale. The first is kind of I would say the middle intrusive, is the best way to put that. And this is at default labels. So what this means is that as we have a label policy defined, and a policy is assigned to a set of users, so I can have different policies for different sets of users, that policy will have specific labels that will be available to it. And those labels will have specific types of actions that they might actually perform. So what we'll see here in a little bit is a simple document that I have with some PCI data in it that you'll see was automatically detected and then suggested a label. Now this can be, again, I was using credit card information as an example, but again, as you create custom information, sensitive information types or trainable classifiers, these can apply across various different contexts. Now, speaking of context, that then gets us into context-based labeling. So, for example, when I onboard a program and I create that program's team, and that is going to be their collaboration space for whatever that mission might be, I know that that content should generally be marked as CUI because I know that that program's specific compliance officer says, yep, a lot of the data we're going to be receiving from our customer or from our prime or from the DoD is going to be CUI there. So our default label over there is going to be CUI export controlled, for example. Now, this can be done on existing content as well. So in other words, I can take an existing SharePoint site that I've identified, either through a business owner or through policy simulation and through PowerShell or through the GUI. I can actually set a default label for that SharePoint site, for a document library, and those types of things. That could also be for meetings as well. So you can also classify meetings at a specific label. And again, that would also then apply to any content that's created within that, whether that be a PowerPoint that's shared or a Word document that's uploaded or the chat itself. That context applies to all the content within it. Now, lastly is automatic labels. So automatic labeling is a great mature step to take once you've really honed in on the labels. If you're going to be using trainable classifiers or sensitive information types that you create, once you've really refined those and validated that there's not going to be any sort of large business impact to doing so. So there's client-side auto labeling, which is what you'll see an example of here in a second, for when mails are being composed or when new Word documents are created, a PowerPoint, Excel, even PDFs. And then there's server-side labeling. So in other words, it's almost similar to this context-based labeling, but I can do that at any content in transit for mail or at rest for SharePoint Online, OneDrive, etc. So these are kind of the three core ways that we apply labels. Now there are others as well. So for example, we can apply labels through Defender for Cloud Apps at a really, really granular level there. For an example, we can make sure that a label is applied when a user, for example, is trying to export content or exfil content on a maybe a non-trusted network or something like that. So let's show a label example here. This was a label example that was worked through with a customer, and this is a pretty large customer, and they decided that simple was better for them, and through some quite a few number of workshops, interviews, this is what we landed on. So you see we've got public, and again, so the bold obviously is the name of the label, and then after the hyphen is actually what the description would actually be within the label itself. So this is what the tooltip that users would see. So public, as you can see their description, this is basically anything that is going to be released out to the public. You see general, which is really could be considered anyone can have that, or company internal for sublabels there. You see sensitive, where the definition there is around causing damage or harm to the business if it's shared with unauthorized people, so contracts, forecast summaries, sales account data, etc. And we see we using the same nomenclature, right? So anyone restricted or company internal restricted. So we see it's slightly different there. But we use anyone and company internal across the same thought pattern there. We see highly sensitive. In this case, things like source code or health-related information, HR data, those types of things. And you see, again, the same usage there, verbiage. Now, this one adds some additional restrictions, right? So removes the ability for a user, regardless of who it is, to print or to copy out or extract data out, as well as for emails that can't be forwarded. And the last one here is really interesting, which allows only 24-hour offline access. If you think about the reason why this might be important, let's say a laptop is left at an airport by an executive, and that falls into the wrong hands, but it takes a week. Well, their ability, even if they were able to get into that laptop through brute force or through whatever they might use tool-wise, that account's ability to offline access that data had expired in that time frame. So that even if they had that Excel file open, that time bomb would hit, and as soon as they went to go to change Windows over to Excel, Excel would kick them out and say that they no longer have access to that file. And then lastly, we've got a CUI label with CUI spelled out in this case, and talks about, of course, what it is, even just under Executive Order 13526 or Atomic Energy Act, etc. And then we have general CUI and then CUI export controlled with the DoD recommended visual markings. In this case, does the same aspects, and then I think might have got cut off. There's one more bullet. It would apply header to footer with the appropriate export controlled ITAR or general CUI content there as far as in the header and footer. So very basic here. This could be used as a starting point for a lot of organizations, but there's also talking points, and there's certain business requirements that may need to change slightly how this would be deployed, but this is, again, a starting point here. So kind of wrapping up on the labeling practices aspect here. At the end, really, you're going to get to using auto-labeling policies for consistent classification. In other words, this should be your point at which you feel very mature. We can apply DLP and retention policies based on the label. So in other words, extend that label functionality across not only just labeling the content, but also on the other aspects of M365 and Purview. And again, reporting and compliance. Let's jump into that for a second. So you may be familiar if you've gone to the Purview. So as with always, we've had a various set of evolving portals. As administrators in M365 over the years, we had the security and compliance portal for a while. That's now been broken out, that we have the security portal, and then we have the Purview portal. The Purview portal is where you're going to focus your efforts, in this case, on the screenshots we're going to see here. So in the Purview portal, there's this concept of the Content Explorer. So what the Content Explorer essentially does is says, here is content that through either users labeling, automatic labeling, or through discovery, and based on trainable classifiers and sites that I've pointed it at, I've identified. Now, this view, I will make sure I state, access to this Content Explorer is restricted by 2 additional roles that have to be added. A global admin does not have access to this. And in fact, you really should not have users have consistent access to this. Essentially what this means is I can go and actually view this content. I'm not going to bring that up on this case, but I have full access to the content that's being listed here. So if this was on the portal and I clicked over on this Exchange arrow here, it would take me into a view where I could actually see the emails, the content, who sent them, all those things. And so access to this should be very tightly restricted. In fact, it should really be, those should be groups that should be monitored with alerts, et cetera, because this is a big, it's almost like having an e-discovery role where I can actually view just about any content in the organization. So that's the Content Explorer, really helpful for finding spaces and storage areas where you might not be thinking that CUI exists, or in this case CUI, but whatever label you wanted to apply. And then there's Activity Explorer. So Activity Explorer, slightly different. This is focusing on how and when labels were applied. There's a couple of different aspects to it. There's some built-in filters. If that's a little blurry, I apologize. I thought the screen capture was good, but you can see that there's some built-in filters. So things like activities, files containing sensitive information types, sensitivity labels applied, changed, or removed. That's an interesting one, right? Because maybe you want to know all the activities that are happening when people are removing labels. So you can use those built-in filters, or there's a bunch of drill downs up here. But what you can see is actually, in this case, I've just got two in this case. It was a test tenant, but you see that there's labels applied to these particular emails going back and forth between some testing here or something. But at a large scale, right, you're going to see a lot more of this, right? So once you start deploying labels, you'll start to see where those are triggered and where those activities are happening. If we were to pull up one of these and you see the detail, here in this case is the detail of label applied. It says the sensitivity label was test label 1. There's the email subject. In this case, it's emails. You can actually even go view this email if I wanted to in the portal there. So it does give you some information about that. And of course, all of this is audit logged information, right? So you could actually build reports off of this. You can build Sentinel alerting off of this. All this information can be built into a reporting pipeline on labeling. So let's talk about governance and review. So as organizations mature, there's a couple of things that they're going to want to make sure that they do around labeling. This may fall into compliance practice quarterly audit in general, or it may be something that IT wants to handle themselves and then maybe report up. But doing quarterly audits of label usage, you should almost always be seeing an increase. People are always creating content, which means we should always be seeing an increase of usage. As you get mature, or as you have potentially brought over legacy label information from either something you have deployed today and you want to change that approach, or you had a labeling technology on-prem that you want to sunset, certainly thinking about retiring unused and redundant labels. Refined definitions. You're likely going to get a lot of feedback on this. People, if you've got a great comms plan and a great advocate and champions, hopefully it's not a ton of feedback that's negative. But when you do get feedback, certainly take that into account. Have a mechanism to actually, for users to report that. And then lastly, of course, as we always say, SSPs are evolving. And so make sure those changes to labels are documented within your SSP as well. So diving a little bit more deeply into lifecycle and management, communication is key here. Understanding how users are going to perceive this potentially invasive thing into their day, and making sure that they are prepared with the right information to understand how it actually affects them and why it's important. Piloting across the business, this goes back to the policy simulation slide, where we can actually pilot and either be not effective to users, or we can actually be somewhat effective, but also to a specific subset of users, and start to roll that out in waves. Utilize any available training you have. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Seek and utilize user feedback. As I mentioned, create a place for users to be able to provide feedback, whether that be a champion site within SharePoint or something like that. And again, reporting and metrics and purview, which we kind of just talked about there on the Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, those are really helpful for understanding the impact of labels on users. So aligning CMMC and ITAR to labels, right? So certainly going to map labels to CMMC level 2 and 3 requirements, sub-labels, as we mentioned, and also clear documentation to support audit readiness in your SSP and defensible position. If we take a look at the CMMC model, by our count, roughly 25 controls can be met across 6 families. Maybe addressed fully or partially through the use of purview information protection. Three I just want to highlight there, all of which kind of say similar things, of course. Our access control L2 3.1.3, which is control the flow of CUI in accordance with approved authorizations. You see media protection L2 3.8.4, mark media, and then PS 3.9.2 ensure that CUI are protected during and after actions. In other words, make sure users don't have access to data if they get termed and they've got it on a USB drive, for example. So again, just three. If you want more information about that, there's the CMMC product placemat, which you can filter on purview, that gives some more information about that as well. But from a why this is important perspective, this is a great piece of information to be able to take, and if you're starting a program on labeling, these are great places to start because you can have defensible controls to say, yes, we are actually, this is helping us meet these specific controls across these families that we otherwise may have to put in a POEM. So talking about user training and adoption, as we've kind of trumpeted here, fewer labels, fewer decisions, better adoption. In other words, if a user is presented with 50 different options, they're probably not going to choose any of them. If they're presented with 5, they're probably going to choose one that makes the most sense for them. Providing training, however that might take its form, whether that be in-person training or webinars, etc. Also include labeling best practices in employee onboarding. This is a great point to be able to stress that, especially for maybe users who are new to the DIB, you likely already have some of that in onboarding processes that maybe that your HR department runs or IT runs. Simply add a little bit of content around labeling best practices and how to understand that and what they might experience, and that's certainly help as well. For any customers here on the call that are Evolve 365 customers, which is a Planet training and adoption platform, there is labeling content and training already in that portal. Not only is labeling content there, but if you happen to have the security awareness training add-on, there's also guidance on that aspect from the DoD side. So talking a little bit about labeling experience. So I mentioned earlier that I was just quick, kind of a couple of screenshot demos here. This is not Alex Lifeson's real credit card number, and if it was, it would be expired. But there's a great website out there. I think it's dlptests.com that actually generates legit credit card numbers and information, so you can actually use it to test your DLP rules for things like PHI or PCI. Anyways, so I threw this into a Word document, and as soon as I put it in there, it actually popped up. I hadn't even saved it yet. So it's a combination of Office having active labeling in it, and it knows my label policy that's applied to me from Planet. And it's also then giving me a policy tip here, right? So it's actually recommending that because of the credit card, well, it's got an underline there. Because of the credit card information, I can apply a sensitivity, and it's recommending confidential/anyone. I can also hit show sensitive content. So if I was in a bigger document that was 40 pages long, and maybe that information was on page 20, I happened to paste it all in, it would take me right down to that. So again, this is an example of automatic classification as well. There's also the idea of relabeling. So let's say that I had labeled this previous document as confidential anyone, and I wanted to downgrade that label and change it. Well, when I do that, I can force my users to actually put an explanation in there. This is then tagged to that event, and I can then, of course, for example, create a Sentinel rule that says, hey, I need to be alerted every time a label was downgraded that contains the word CUI, for example, or from CUI/export control. And I can start an actual incident on that if I needed to. There's also the concept of specific permissions. So if I had gone in and I had chose highly sensitive limited, then I would get this pop-up that said I could actually change who could actually view. I could have restricted editor rights, owners. And then you see those other options that I mentioned around document expiration, on who they can request additional permissions from, whether they can access the content programmatically. This is a new one. Or they can actually require a user to verify that permission. Or require a connection to verify the user's permission. In other words, it can't be opened offline. even with that 24-hour time bomb. So wrapping up here, some real world lessons. Start small, expand as needed. You can always add more and make it more complex if you need to, but starting small is good. Pilot groups before rolling out. This is a no-brainer with the ability to scope and have those policies applied to specific user sets. And then again, use feedback to refine the taxonomy. Got another poll here. What's your biggest challenge in implementing a successful labeling system? I know mine. I'll wait for Casey to pop that poll up. There it is.
Loading slowly. Bear with me.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think a lot of these this was certainly created from what the feedback we're hearing from our customers. And to me, it's low adoption and user confusion are the biggest challenge we typically see. That the program, we have a lot of organizations that go through the process to create the program, and perhaps there wasn't maybe a focus on OCM, or there's not as much executive buy-in as they hope to get. And so while there's an understanding that there needs to be a compliant need to do it, some organizations have kind of hit that roadblock. So as we wrap up here, some key takeaways. Labeling is foundational to a CMMC assessment readiness and the future, as well as secure AI adoption. It's really important in the sense of as we start to see CMMC readiness be part of contract award, there are going to be places where if an organization is not mature and not in a defensible position around CUI marking, for example, that could potentially impact business. Again, iterate it one more time. Fewer, well-structured labels improve outcomes. Use the automation that's available. This has gotten really good over the years. And then also make sure that those labels, as they're now in the organization, are applied across all the potential pathways where their usefulness can be extended, whether that be Purview, DLP, Insider Risk, or Defender for Cloud Apps, or all across the platform. And it looks like we got a hand up from Micah.
Hey, Matt. This is Micah Shields from AM General. We have a interesting problem that I think many others might as well with labeling, where as soon as we add in a label and then we try to send that document, for example, which might not even be CUI, but we send that to our government customer or someone in a commercial tenant, and they can't open it. I've heard that Microsoft might be having a webinar next Thursday to kind of talk about maybe some fixes for that. But have you run into that? And what do you recommend organizations do when labeling doesn't seem to work cross-cloud?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is something that has been definitely a challenge. There are some things happening on the service side that are going to improve that, specifically between GCC High and DoD tenants. That capability should be enhanced in the coming months. Maybe I don't know about the webinar you're talking about, but I imagine they'll probably talk about the service changes there that are going to happen. So that should hopefully resolve a lot of it. I think the thing, thinking about the other use case you mentioned around a commercial tenant not being able to open, I have heard limited issues there, but that functionality I believe has been in place for quite a long time. Yeah, I would like to have a conversation with you about it because I think that'd be interesting to hear the specifics where you guys are having issues. I know I would say back when I would say maybe 4 years ago, when cross-cloud access of data was limited, and where you might be using, for example, the encryption portal as opposed to built into the apps, there was limited capabilities there. But as they've moved the Office apps to be more aware of information protection and multi-cloud, I think that experience has improved. But would love to. I think that's a great conversation to have. Would love to hear more about it.
Our Microsoft Enterprise rep sent me that webinar. So I'll ask her that I can share it, and if I can, I'll give it to you in case any of the other customers on this call are interested. You might want to reach out to Matt and the team.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for doing that. Okay. Let's see here. Got a couple of questions coming in the chat. Any advice for labeling data in SQL proprietary files such as SolidWorks or Altium? Millions of files containing CUI. Yeah, so there is, I'll see if I can find it here while we're on the call. There is a set of, there's a set of supported file types that exist out there. I don't know that SolidWorks or Altium are on there, but we'll find out here. So there's a couple of things. Some of those larger third-party apps have built in via the Purview SDK support for labeling either within the app or within Explorer. So if you remember the old Azure Information Protection client, it used to have, you would right-click on a file in Explorer, and it would be able to be, you could label it as such. So some of those apps, for example, CAD has that ability, and so CAD files can be labeled that way. And so what I've seen is that some of those software vendors either have an add-in for their app to be able to take advantage of that. It may be free, it may be paid, or they have a specific set of processes that you put in place to be able to do that. So I don't know specifically for SolidWorks or for Altium, but here is the list of file types, and you may, if you've got that much content, yeah, the issue becomes where it's stored. Most likely, if we're talking about EDS types things, or those types of things, they're probably stored locally because they're huge files and probably are not stored on things like OneDrive or SharePoint. And there's a couple of questions around on-prem storage we'll get to here in a second as well that might be helpful there. As it relates to SQL, so while not available yet, eventually when Fabric does come to GCC High, the merging of Azure Purview and Microsoft Purview will occur. So that's already occurred on the commercial side, in the sense that you can actually connect to specific Azure resources or AWS resources or many third-party resources and actually perform not only data labeling, but also protection. This gets down to even to the table or row level in SQL. If it's Azure managed, SQL managed SQL instance or SQL as a service over on the Azure side. If it's on-prem, I don't believe that that's supported. But there is a whole host of things that merging of the Purview side on Azure and on the Microsoft 365 side are going to unlock. I have no idea other than that is dependent on Fabric. So we haven't received a timeline on Fabric coming to High yet. So at this point, the best I can say is, there are some avenues within Azure today, but I'd be hesitant to go down that path because I don't know either what a migration path or how that would be converged into your eventual M365 data estate as well. Because there's data map, which you can also use on the Azure side, which has that functionality, but unsure of how that's going to be merged in, specifically on the GCC High side. Okay. I think I made a couple of slides for these pre-registration questions. Yes. Okay. So the first two are very similar, at least in my mind, is how do labels flow with the file and move onto servers, removable storage, or emailed. So essentially that information is stored as metadata. In this case, I just took a quick screenshot here of where that's stored as metadata on the file. And when the file is opened, there's some specific checks that have to happen. Now, you may say, okay, well, I've emailed that Word document. I try to open it through Google Docs, which can open Word documents, right? There are specific things in that document that are going to prevent it from being able to be opened. If I'm using an older version of Office, 2010, 2013, even 2016, without the correct patches, it's just going to time out and not open. So the first thing, kind of line of defense there, is you have to have a supported client to be able to open it, and that information flows with the document. It can't be removed, in a nefarious way. It's just there. Now, if I have permission to open the document, I open it with a supported app, and I want to downgrade that label, and my organization allows me to remove a label or downgrade a label, then yes, I can go do that. But as the document or piece of content is in transport, that label is going to apply, and protections are going to apply regardless of where it's at. And that's could be, third-party systems, email, etc. Next one here about server-side labeling performance, which is documented about 100,000 files per day for on-premises file servers, on-prem SharePoint. Is it useful or not? So here's what we particularly find useful about the agent that can be deployed on premises. And you can deploy multiple agents that can run in higher volumes, though there's still a throttle on the information it can contribute. It is great for discovering where you may not think you have CUI. So if you have a good set of trainable classifiers and sensitive information types that you've developed based on cloud content, and you're really confident that, yep, I think this can actually help us find CUI on-prem, we don't necessarily have to label anything or protect it. That data just simply flows into the dashboards that we've seen as screenshots here. So it can actually tell me, yeah, there's this file server that I just went and found that has like 50,000 pieces of CUI, CUI documents on it. You can go find that, say, hey, are we protecting this? Who has access to it? What is its disposition? So I think it's great at finding data. Can you use it to label data? Yes, you can. More appropriately, generally, it's building a business practice around how, if your organization is up for doing it, how to get that data into a cloud service where it can have even more visibility and protection and those types of things into it, right? Because if I identify maybe a program that's dormant, for example, where that data is not being used anymore, it is still CUI, I have to keep it, but I really don't need to regularly access it, or I want to put it in a place that just I can set it and forget it and not have to worry about it. Good, go bring that into a SharePoint site, make sure the permissions are correct, it sits there, and you can go regain that storage on-prem or stand down that file server, etc. So I think the discovery aspect is probably the best part of the Purview labeling agent that could be deployed on-prem. But if you wanted to actually label data, you can do that. It doesn't need to be in the cloud. Any other questions? Great. Well, appreciate everybody coming today. Appreciate you, Micah, offering to share that webinar. If the Microsoft folks are okay with sharing that with this group, we'll certainly do so. And look forward to seeing everybody at our next Defense Industrial Base. You already own it. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thanks all.